Don't start yet. Hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor. Today on the show, a veteran of Second Life, Ken Liu. He is here, I believe, for the third time. His avatar is from 2005. He's 2 years older than I am. He's a veteran of the book club and Second Life itself. Now, I have known Ken as a master of short stories. We talked about his the Hidden Girl compilation. We know him, or I know him as a master translator as well of the Three Body Problem and several other books. But up until recently, I was not aware of his Dandelion Dynasty series. So I said, or he said, why don't you invite me back? And I complied, uh, not knowing that the Dandelion Dynasty is absolutely mind expanding and possibly mind blowing. It's now comprising 4 books. I believe the fourth one is not officially out. It comes out next month. Boy, this is epic. If I had the opportunity to blurb this, I would say this is the War and Peace for lovers of fantasy. Now, let me very briefly try to whet your appetite with kind of a little, I don't know, synopsis or short overview what this is all about. I read 2 books this week. These are huge tomes. I think the Wall of Storms is about it's 850 pages. It's the second one. The first one is The Grace of Kings, and we'll have Ken dive into it. So I don't want to take away from his time by sort of haphazardly trying to tell you what this book is about. But the book is about the fictional island kingdoms of Dara, and this is a world that's basically was basically constant intrigue and warfare. It's a world of airships, of strange animals. There's this whale-like creature, the Kruben, with a big horn coming out of the front of it, and later invaders come to Dara through a wall of storms that surrounds Dara, and they have these fire-breathing Garnafins. The story starts with an assassination attempt on an emperor that tried to unify all these different kings. Didn't work out. A little street kid watches that assassination attempt, and he later teams up with a man of nobility to unite the kingdom again. Very mismatched pairing, makes for intense and awesome discussions about deep philosophy, about the nature of men. Is men, I'm talking about men. There's also a lot of women in this book, which is amazing. Um, but there are philosophical ruminations. Ken also actually devised for this series 4 different strands of philosophy. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing. There's great food, there's wonderful art, there's class consciousness brewing among the workers, revolution, counter-revolution, sacrifice for love of country, yeah, and intense violence and all the rest of it. I will now shut up and walk up here. Oh, we should say we're here in a dandelion field. I mean, this is the Dandelion Dynasty, and we'll ask Ken why the Dandelion Dynasty. So we're starting here today on a field of dandelions. There's a little rabbit here in front of me. There's a raft. There are turtles. There are whales. There are boats. And there are airships above. I'm going to climb up this ladder here, which hopefully leads me um, to where the show is happening. I don't know. You never know with Second Life. Oh, look at this. We have a full house, um, and big applause for our set builder, the set mistress, Ruby, who basically synthesized um, the world of Dara with our very limited resources in terms of time and space, making this set. So if the camera can zoom around while I'm trying to sit here, can't even sit on my own throne. We built 2 thrones. We'll say hi to Ken in a minute. Let's have the camera zoom around a little bit and show us these floating airships, these floating islands. And these are all just little bits and pieces of the kingdom of Dara. And there are people actually, some of the audience is sitting on these other airships that are floating about. And there are doves floating about. They symbolize peace, but don't despair. There is no peace in Dara. I mean, there's very short-lived peace, and then there's the next conflict. There's a dragon, maybe the Sagaranafen, I don't know. But Ken is here. Ken Liu, thank you so much for coming. It's so wonderful to have you back.
Thank you, Draxtor, and I want to echo your thanks to Ruby for building this awesome set. Every time I come here, I get more amazed by what is possible here. It's really cool. Ruby, thank you.
There's also these floating lanterns. Floating lanterns, they appear every once in a while in
I
your book.
love
And
that. Yeah, I
yeah.
love the floating lanterns. That's so cool.
And also in front of me on the floor, if the camera can zoom down there, there is a board game. It's
Yep.
made by a Second Life. For this board game is called Berserker, and I was just realizing, wait a minute, you in your books in the story, there's this board game Krupa, that is essential.
It's
And
actually
also,
the other one. This is Zamaki you're thinking of, but yes, it is a
oh
board game similar to this one. So yes, perfect.
wait, but Zamaki doesn't. That happens in book 3 and 4. Don't spoil anything. I
Oh,
haven't read those.
sorry, you're right.
Oh my God, you destroyed it. No, but this is also a
Well,
metaphor. I mean, the book is so full of metaphors for flowers and games, and they all just stand in for, I guess, how we organize society, right? And how we relate to each other.
yeah, I guess so. I mean, I never thought of that way, but yeah, that makes perfect sense. But I
Now,
do love the board game. It's very cool.
now I try to sort of summarize this. How would you summarize it? You're at a cocktail party and you go, "Ah, I'm a writer." Oh, you're a writer. So what do you write about? Oh, the Dandelion Dynasty. Oh, what's that all about?
Yeah,
Um,
it's tough. I mean, it's like
it is.
your summary is as good as any. I mean, the way I describe it is I just say it's an epic fantasy in which the heroes are not wizards but engineers. That's basically the
Oh.
way I summarize it. It's because it's about engineering of all different sorts. There's literally the traditional sort of engineering about building new technologies, but it's also about political engineering. It's about how do you build institutions that channel popular preferences into healthy channels, and how do you build institutions that are resistant to corruption? How do you build institutions that are conducive to a healthy constitutional monarchy, and perhaps in the future a more democratic form of government? How do you build the organs of collective decision making?
Mhm.
So it's about engineering in all its forms.
This is pretty awesome. I didn't think about that at all, but you're right. I mean, that is the organizing of society that you're describing, and these wonderful. It's almost like you're arguing with yourself. Later, I'm going to ask you which branch of the philosophy you most subscribe to, but I could imagine that you're probably uh, you do have a legal background. I imagine that you look at this also a little bit from a lawyer's side who is getting ready for trial and kind of anticipating what the opponent will sort of bring forward in terms of argument, right? A little
Right.
bit.
There is a lot of arguing with myself in there, because I think a lot of these questions are eternal questions. You know, they were questions debated from the time of Thucydides to the Enlightenment to today. We don't have answers for some of these. Some of the problems and about how to build a meritocracy, how to build a system that reflects the desires and preferences of the largest number of people. These are not questions that we have solved, and they are
They
fantasy
are,
doesn't solve them any easier. So I struggle with them. So of course, there's going to be a lot of back and forth.
we can talk later because I have all the answers. Anyways, of course I don't. But I put up the map. So the map of I mean, fantasy is awesome because there are maps. And I mean, I was a huge Conan the Barbarian fan just with the maps and stuff like that. And you have this wonderful map in the book. Actually, the German version, even the paperback has a high glossy quality map here by Robert Lassaretti. I put it up on the board behind me. The interesting thing is, west is up and north is to the right. So if the camera zooms into this map, this is the first thing that might come that might you might find a little strange.
Yeah,
But
it's one of the first decisions that surprised me a little bit. I mean, I drew a map for the world, but when I did it, because of I'm a writer, so I do most of my drafting in a portrait orientation, not
oh,
landscape. So I drew my map vertically, with north at the top. And then when they tried to put this into the book, they had two choices. One is to put it on one page, which would preserve the same orientation as I had it, or they could turn it 90 degrees so that it would fit on two pages. Um, by putting it on two pages, you get more details in, but the consequence of that is north now is to the right, which is unusual and a little strange for readers not used to it. But all in all, I think this was the right decision
and
because
I thought it
otherwise,
was, you know what, to me, now that I know the backstory, it was like, that makes sense. But I thought like, hey, this makes it even more interesting. Like this makes it even more like, unusual or like some exotic in a way that, these people on this fictional kingdom or group of kingdoms, they just have their maps different than us. I thought that there
that
was.
is true. I mean, historically, we did not all settle on having north at the top of maps until modern times. Traditionally, different cultures did it differently. So you're right. There's no reason to preserve the north is up convention in a fantasy novel. So at first, I was a little concerned that readers might be confused, but then like you, I said, okay, you know what, it works because people will just get used to it, and it will be a sign that we're not in quote unquote the world we're in. So that works.
Now, I have a million questions, and I'm debating where to go next. I do have a run
Do you
sheet
want me
here.
to start by just sort of describing a little bit and then talking and doing the first reading and then we'll go from there? Does that
I
work for you, or do you have a different agenda you want to pursue?
I have two questions up front. Number one, because I emailed you, can you provide a little bit of the Chinese background of this story? And then you email back and say, wait, this is really not based on Chinese dynasties. And I go like, oh, but since it's dedicated sort of to your grandma that you fondly remember listening together with her on the radio and her introducing you to the Han Dynasty, I immediately assumed that this is somehow, again, we're talking about thousands of pages here of chronicling a long time of the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires and endless struggle and intrigue that is somehow based or maybe even sort of veiled in this fantasy of actual Chinese history. And then you said, no, 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 this is actually not the case. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. Is this the riot? Is this the Russian Revolution? And is this how Stalin sort of corrupted the initial cause? And then I started interpreting all sorts of different things in there. And I mean, this is to me uh, the biggest compliment that I can make to a writer, that the interpreter the way we can interpret this, or the multitude of interpretations and speculations, what the writer was trying to say with this, or where the initial inspiration came from, is just, you cannot pin it down. So anyway, this is what I do want to ask you first. What's the inspiration for constructing this?
Yeah, so I want to just follow up on what you said there and sort of explain the thing. So if you read Lord of the Rings, it's obviously inspired by the great Western oral epics. It's very much inspired by um, our very old Anglo-Saxon and um, Northern European traditions, the sagas, and of course. So to say, but that's probably not the most interesting way to read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, one very interesting way to read it is as a metaphor for World War II. So despite its deep inspiration in traditional European lore, very few people would read it as a mere retelling of those lore, even though it in some sense is. But it's really ultimately concerned about evil, good, and modernity in the guise of a medieval mindset. In the same way that A Song of Ice and Fire is inspired by the War of the Roses, but it's really not about War of the Roses. It's much more about a modern sensibility. It's very much about eternal human conditions. Or Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is not really about the Romans. It's really about concerns of the days of Shakespeare. It's about eternal political issues. It's about the politics of England. It's about the politics of empire. It's about the politics of what does it mean to be a constitutional democracy? What does tyranny mean? So in all of those cases, readers are able to step outside of the historical influence and say, yes, there's some history inspiration. That's the stuff that the author decides to use to tell the story, but the story really is about us. What's a little frustrating to me is because I'm using a non-Western tradition, Western readers tend to focus only on the non-Westernness of it. They seem to feel that the story has nothing to do with them. They, like you, ask about the Chinese inspiration, but I don't care about the Chinese inspiration. It's sort of like talking to Julius Caesar and ask him all about, talking to Shakespeare and say, tell me more about Romans, Well, it's not interesting. The Romans are stories everyone knows. That's not what this is about. This is about eternal human verities.
Oh, no, no,
Same thing
no,
here.
absolutely. No. I mean, and I hope that is clear also to the audience. I was looking at, here's the dedication to your grandmother. Maybe this is where the initial inspiration come from. But what I'm saying, for me, this is absolutely alive right now, here now, especially.
I get it. I get it. I'm not talking about yours, but it's just that when you asked me the question, I was reminded of the fact that there is this tendency to sort of focus on what the story that inspired is, rather than what the story actually is. But I think it is relevant to talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So I have long been interested in the following idea, which is how do nations see themselves? How do they tell their own mythologies? How do they imagine themselves and root themselves in a mythological past? So, sometimes this is done deliberately as a political act. In the case of the Romans, right, they actually deliberately politically asked for an epic to be written, the Aeneid, that actually explains how the Romans came to be and rooting it inside a classical Greek past. The United States, as one of the examples of modernity that we always think about, has its own origin story. And the American origin story, very interestingly, is often based on a Greco-Roman imagined past as well. There's a reason why the Washington, D.C. buildings are always done in this pseudo Greco-Roman style. Our high courts look like temples. We call our legislative building the Capitol. We actually have senators, and our founding fathers actually gave themselves Roman names. The idea of evoking a Roman past, to use Roman analogies to describe the evolution and the origin of the American Republic, is so natural and so often used that we almost act as though the United States is a second Rome or a third Rome or a fourth Rome, depending on how you count Constantinople and Moscow and all the rest of it.
Mm.
So there's this long tradition of describing the American origin story in those
I
terms. And I
remember a
said,
guy in my country, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but he was talking about a Third Reich all the time. He was actually from Austria, but anyways, go ahead.
yeah, right. There's a long tradition of this sort of base things on a mythical past. Anyway, so I said, okay, well, I'm going to do something interesting. What if I could retell the story of modernity using a different mythological origin story? What if I, instead of rooting modernity and the story of America in the story of the Greeks and the Romans, what if I chose to tell the story using an East Asian mythological past? What if I
Mhm.
took a very important founding story in East Asia, which is the founding of the Han Dynasty? What if I took that story and reimagined it as the origin story of a multi-ethnic empire like modern America? What if I could retell essentially the modern story of the United States, the origin story, and recast it as a story using East Asian mythological historical elements? What would that look like? It's a thing that has not been done before, as far as I know, and that's what's interesting to me. I wanted to see if by doing that we will learn new things about the history of the United States. We will learn new things about what it means to have a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi cultural empire. Well, what can
Right,
we
and
learn
how to,
something
yeah,
new about how to
yeah.
preserve a constitution? That's actually the thing that I was interested in the most. Um, Americans are obsessed with our constitution. We're very interested in the Constitution and the idea of the Constitution, and we sort of worship it. The Constitution is probably the closest thing to a sacred document for Americans.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to tell this story essentially about what a constitution actually is. But again, not using Greco Roman references, but using East Asian historical references to talk about American ideas about constitutions. It's weird, it's unusual, it's strange, and that's what makes it interesting.
Absolutely awesome, Ken. And now, as you're explaining this, the mismatch that I mentioned earlier in the first book, Ken Kunigaru and Matazindu, the dialogue that they have, because he comes from a noble family, he's always about preserving the tradition. I mean, I'm simplifying this, of course, but he's about preserving the tradition and the hierarchy. And Cooney is sort of the streetwise guy and say, well, let's try something different. Let's do this. And so for him, if you will, the Constitution is a living document, and for Matazindu, it isn't. I have one excerpt prepared here from the Wall of Storms about what you're talking about, also about government governance and organizing society. This is Cooney talking to his daughter, and he at this point in the narrative is the big boss, the emperor. And Cooney said, "Being a ruler is a lot like carrying a bucket of water. There are always competing forces that threaten to make waves, and it's the ruler's job to find a way to balance the various forces from spilling out of control so that the land may be irrigated and the people fed." Then his daughter Thera says, "Why not just set the bucket down so that it wouldn't be agitated?" And he says, "Then we'd be left with a bucket filled with dead water and nothing would grow. Forward motion is essential, change is the only constant." This is just a wonderful, quick example, and we'll have you read in just a second. But talk a little bit about that, sort of your own, like writing this kind of dialogue, because you have all these different opinions, and especially the interaction with young people that are challenging the status quo with their elders. This is absolutely fascinating. Or women challenging, the patriarchy and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's vast.
Yeah, for me, this is also again just a very essential aspect of modernity. We talk about modernity about sorry, I was just looking at a question in chat, and which I will address, which is actually really quite fun. Actually, let me deal with the question first, and before
Oh
I
yeah,
come
here, this
back
is a good question. Yeah, go ahead.
to this. So Uh, Stella, the question from Stella is, Ken, there must have been two very different ways imperialist power structures were and are viewed from Asian history versus the Roman Greco narrative. Is this what you found? Um, uh, yes and no, actually. I found that narratives about differences are almost always exaggerated. You always find that the idea that there are essential cultural differences to be nonsense when you dig into it. There's, for example, this huge narrative about Asian collectivism, which I found to be total nonsense. So whenever somebody starts talking about how the Chinese are collectivists and the Westerners are individualists, I know that person is not worth listening to. And I would advise you that whenever someone says that, that person can be entirely dismissed because that person doesn't know what he's talking about. So having said all of that, in terms of what differences are, I don't find the differences interesting. What I found to be interesting is to say, because we tell the story of America using Greco-Roman analogies, we end up missing certain stories. We end up just emphasizing
Yep.
certain aspects. We end up saying, this is the way it is, and this is the way all the world is. But there are other stories that are emphasizing different cultural contexts. So, for example, the whole idea um, of teacher-student relationships, the whole idea of passing on information in a genealogy of the mind. This is not an idea foreign to Western conception, of course. We talk about it all the time, but it's not core to the way we talk about things. We don't make it into the center of how we think about it. We don't when we talk about the history of ideas and the history of invention, this is sort of done in passing. We sort of say, okay, well, this is a tradition from the transcendentalists, this is a tradition from here and there, but we don't emphasize who is teaching whom, and we don't emphasize the relationship between student and teacher the same way East Asian narratives do. But the fact is, these relationships are important to us. We do actually care a lot about student-teacher relationships. We just don't use the words to say it. Patron-client relationships, right? As Stella says. That's the way we normally think about it. But when we name something patron-client, we sort of subsume under it a whole bunch of other relationships. We sort of see everything through that lens. What I'm saying is, if you twist the lens a little bit, you'll see new things in our own history that we didn't see before. The part about seeing our own history differently is what I care about. That's the part that's interesting. So again, Americans often talk about federalism as a thing that Americans invented, that this is very key to us. But what about federalism in other parts of the world? What about federalism as practiced under the British Empire? What about federalism as practiced within the Ottoman Empire? What about federalism as practiced in East Asian imperial structures? Are those things actually very different, or are they similar to what we have? So that's what's interesting to me. I'm much more interested in looking at things through a different lens so we can see new aspects of our own history, not so much about saying we are in fact fundamentally different,
And
because I don't think we are.
Ken is doing something really dangerous. He's challenging the Western canon of literature too. I was just talking with I had a long discussion with my wife today, really interesting about the canon, what's referred to the canon, because she was saying, what are you talking about canon? So, well, canon in literature is sort of certain works that are really important that push the form forward, I don't know, Ulysses, Moby Dick, and stuff like that. And it's usually just sort of the Western canon, right? And that's being taught in European schools and in American schools. And while these works are very important, it's completely ridiculous that we still refer to this canon and excluding all sorts of other important works of literature that pushed literature forward and inspired other generations. But that's
So
kind of, yeah. Go ahead.
So, Stella, I want to get back to your question because your question is so key to what I'm trying to do here. So, if I can make an analogy, and I think this will make things a little bit clearer, the way I think about it is there are different languages. Different languages, of course, are different. There are certain things you name in English that you don't have words for in another language. There are certain things you give a name to specifically in German that does not exist as a separate word in English. It doesn't mean that an English speaker does not experience the things named by the German word. They just don't use a word to describe it. But when you name something, when you give a word to something, it does make it different. It makes you see the world slightly differently. It makes you emphasize certain things versus other things. So to give you another concrete example, right? East Asian historical documents tend to emphasize peasant rebellions, armed uprisings by peasants. This historically is not something that Western historians generally emphasize. It doesn't mean that there have not been peasant uprisings. During Roman times, of course there were, and later on in medieval times, and as recently as under the American Republic, there were all sorts of uprisings by those who are in the lower social classes and who feel like they have to. And in fact, you could argue that the Yellow Vest movement is a peasant rebellion of sorts. We just don't, in the West, we don't name them that, and we don't focus our historical narrative around them. So they happen, but they're not a core part of our vocabulary the way they are in East Asian historiography. So once you realize that, you can go back and say, what if I do use that historiographical lens to look at Western history? What if I do now emphasize peasant rebellions? Can I now tell a different kind of story? I mean, I'm not saying anything unique here. This is the process that we do all the time, right? We do this sort of historical revisionism all the time. Historical revisionism often is applying a new vocabulary to re-describe things we know, and in that process, we see things that we don't see
And
before.
creating myths. I actually have a quote from you that I want to pull later about myths. But right now, to what you're saying, I put up a slide here in the back from our research team, and you're writing about language because I want to tell folks that in the Dandelion Dynasty, you also create you created a language. You mentioned earlier you created food and cultural accomplishments of these different kingdoms that all have different expertise. Some are more sort of intellectual in the Han area there, and others are more agricultural, and so on and so forth. And then there's an indigenous population on a faraway island. There's some interaction there. But this is a quote from you that you did in the interview about language, and here it is. You say writers with something to say and worth reading don't settle. They all searched and searched for the perfect language suited to what they had to say, and failing to find it, invented their own tongues. To read them, one must learn their idiolects. It's the only way to see the world they saw. Can you elaborate on that, Ken? So what did you see? What couldn't you describe? And what the heck is an idiolect?
An idiolect is a language as spoken by an individual. So, we often sort of think that people speak a certain language and they belong to some standardized speech community, but in reality, everyone speaks slightly differently. Everyone uses words slightly differently, and everyone has their own preferred syntax. So,
Does it include accents and stuff and regional
it does,
regionality?
but it's much broader than that. It's about their idiosyncratic usage of language, their own unique particular practice of it. An idiolect is like a dialect, but of one. It's your own unique language. And my point is that writers do have to invent their own language if they want to be interesting, because the smoother and the less effort it takes to read them, the more they trade in cliches.
Right.
Cliches are effortless, and so you don't need to. There's a reason why certain writers, who I will not name, are write books that are completely forgettable, even though they're very easy to read.
Dan Brown. Dan Brown. Sorry, that's a running joke.
You can say whoever you want, but I'm not going to name anybody. But when they do that, they're writing, they're trading cliches, and that is why it's not particularly interesting, and you don't remember them. There's a reason historically when you look at writers who are very popular in a time period and why they end up not being read outside of that brief time. It's because they traded only in cliches. But the people who ended up challenging readers and writing things that could only be said in the language they invented will end up being remembered. They may in fact start a whole new literary movement or become progenitors of an entirely new literary style.
And
That's
also,
just the way it is.
And they will also die poor. Sorry.
Oftentimes that is true. It is the way of the world. Uh, but maybe we should get into some reading and
Absolutely.
some
You
discussing.
mentioned earlier the relationship between, we're going to get to the reading. This is the perfect segue because you mentioned the relationship between the teacher and the student. And one of the most compelling, I mean, there's so many great characters, but one of the most compelling is Mimi, that later her name changes. But this section that you're going to read introduces us to Mimi and the relationship with her teacher, Luanzia. And that's just an amazing um, relationship. Do you want to set it up a little bit? Who is she? Where does she come from?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it. So, I'm going to be reading to you 3 excerpts from the life of
Let's
this
do just
character.
one, and then we'll sprinkle them through. It's
Yeah,
better that
we
way.
will, but I want to describe the whole arc. So I'm going to be reading to you 3 excerpts from the arc of one character whose name is Zomi Kadusu. But Zomi is her formal name. She doesn't start out with that name. She earns it later on. She starts out just being known as Mimi, a very simple peasant girl. And she is born into at the end of a period of civil strife. So if you want to imagine it, there's, as Draxtor described earlier, there were these tremendous wars between the different states, and there were revolutions and counter-revolutions and all this horrible slaughter that happened. Finally, a period of peace has returned, and all the islands of Dara are unified under one ruler. So you can sort of imagine this is sort of like maybe like the old Hawaiian islands after King Kamehameha has unified the islands. So they enjoyed this brief period of time when the islands are all under one administration, and there's a lot of effort and investment by the new government into infrastructure, and there's a conscious effort to create a constitution, not a document per se, but rather I trained as a lawyer, so for me, a constitution is not a document. It's a set of practices and a set of stories, if you will, that people believe about who they are and how they go about making collective decisions. So in the middle of all of this, there are a lot of reforms. The new emperor, who is Kunigaru, has implemented a huge amount of reforms. But from the perspective of a peasant on the ground, a lot of these reforms are misguided and they don't necessarily work, and she doesn't even feel them. She is a poor young woman who has no opportunity for education, but she's very intensely curious. She's very curious about the world, and she wants to know if there's a larger world outside of the one that she's been able to see and inhabit so far. And one last thing, she has a physical disability. In her youth, she was struck by lightning, so she has to walk about with the help of a walking stick. It's something that she has learned to live with, and it's part of her. And she is sensitive about it when other people bring it up. But so the very first excerpt I'm going to read to you is about Mimi as a young girl going to the market to help run an errand for her mother, and how she encounters the scholars in the market. And her love of learning is kindled in this moment. Okay, so this will be about 4 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
One day, hold on, let me see if I can stand up, and we'll do the reading.
Actually, we just decided. Oh yeah, okay. Now you're standing up.
Okay.
I was just, yeah, that looks good.
Okay. All right. Ready? All right. Here we go. One day, Mimi was in the markets at Dai. She was old enough for Aki to trust her to take care of selling the harvested grain and paying the landlord their rent all by herself. She was a better negotiator than Aki, in any event. The sons and daughters of the wealthy rode through the streets on horseback, whips singing through the air, and Mimi and the other peasants dodged out of their way. Her hobbling gait and the heavy load of the grain sample bag meant that sometimes she was too slow, and several times the horses came close to trampling her. But Mimi only gritted her teeth and did not complain. Just as there were many ways of seeing, there were many ways of walking. The scholars and bureaucrats of the emperor rode more sedately through the streets on comfortable carts pulled by teams of horses, and they kept their gazes averted from the dirty, numb, malnourished faces of the poor next to the sewer ditches hugging the road. Mimi tamped down her anger. That was the way of the world, wasn't it? Emperor Reagan was supposed to care about the lives of the common people, but there were gradations among the commoners as well. As far as she could tell, it was only the people who were already well off who sang the praises of the new reign. It was as useless to think about how she and her mother could also lead a life of ease and luxury, to be dressed in silk instead of rough hemp, to eat soft white rice instead of sandy millet that scratched their teeth, as it was for a dandelion to think that it could be honored like the chrysanthemum. A crowd was gathered at the center of the market, curious and hoping for some exciting performance of magic or acrobatics. She pushed her way through the thronging spectators, wielding her walking stick like an oar through the thick mud and water. She was disappointed to see only two men sitting face to face on a woven mat at the center, their hair styled in the double scroll bun indicative of their rank as Toko Dawiji, scholars who had passed the first level of the Imperial examinations. Knows that the closer something is, the bigger it appears, and the farther it is, the smaller, said the first scholar. It is your contention, then, that the sun is closer at dawn and dusk, but farther away at noon, thus explaining why it looks bigger at sunrise and sunset? Asked the second scholar. Plainly, said the first scholar. But everyone also knows that the closer a source of heat is, the hotter it feels. How do you explain the fact that the sun feels hottest at noon, but cooler at dawn and dusk, if the sun is in fact farther away at noon? Asked the second scholar. The first scholar furrowed his brows, stumped by this puzzle. Simple, your explanation is wrong, said the second scholar. It is not wrong, said the first scholar, his face turning red. The great sage Confucius explained that nature, like human society, follows a discernible structure of hierarchy. The sun is as far above the earth as the emperor is above the common people. It only follows that the gods must have intended the sun to be at its greatest distance from the earth when it is at its apex, symbolizing the grace and nobility of the imperial throne. But what about the noonday heat, my learned friend? Asked the second scholar. That is easily explained. The first scholar took a drink from his cup of tea and furtively glanced at the crowd around them. Now that so many people were watching, he had to win this debate. He put the cup down and raised his voice, injecting into it an arrogant confidence. Sometimes it was enough to sound like one knew what one was talking about. Your argument assumes that the sun is at a constant temperature, but that is not so. Employing pure reason, we discover that if the sun feels hottest at its farthest point from the earth at noon, it must also gradually increase in heat as it rises and cool down as it sets. The point at which the sun is hottest is also when it is highest, which is indeed the most perfect design. Does the world follow a design that can be perceived? Mimi wondered. Is nature a model for society, so that what is natural is also what is just? She had never heard of such arguments before, and she was mesmerized. The learned men seemed to think that the world itself was a kind of speech that could be decoded. She remembered her attempts to understand the conversation of the gods as a child. She yearned for such knowledge, knowledge that would allow her to interpret the signs of the gods, to see through the veil of the world, and get a glimpse of the truth.
And that is Ken Liu reading from The Wall of Storms as we get introduced to Mimi. Thank you, Ken. This is amazing. You can sit back down, and this, as you were saying, Mimi, the peasants, the class that she is in, they don't see anything differently, or their material conditions changed at all with the pacifying of the environment. And what I love about this excerpt as well is like this people you see the people who have the leisure time to just engage in sort of intellectual debates. It's almost like a, I don't know, it's like a not a Twitter feud, but people who sit there and just discuss ad nauseum something. And and she is there and working in the fields for 10, 12 hours and goes like, wow, interesting. These people have time to sit around and pursuing sort of matters of thought and stuff.
I don't know, Drax. You want to help me out here? I'm having trouble sitting down properly again.
You're all good. There you
Oh,
go.
you did it.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's magic. I forgot. I actually made a mistake. Luan Zia comes next. Her teacher, but Mimi is one of the most uh, fascinating characters, and Zumi later. Now, I want to ask you, meritocracy. There's a lot of stuff in the book about the good faith actors in positions of power. They do think about how to level the playing field, but there's a lot of really good dialogue and storylines that you concoct there that illustrate how A, difficult that is, B, maybe impossible in a complex society, but C, also how deluded the elites are when they try to, hey, wait a minute, we designed this curriculum and this exam, so everybody's on a level playing field. And then at this one point, Mimi says, well, wait a minute, you guys have time to read all these books. I have to work in the field for 10 hours. I might be more intelligent than you guys are, but I just really don't have time to kind of absorb all this knowledge. So when I come to this exam, I'm going to be disadvantaged. So that's one
That's
of the aspects of these books that I love. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these are again, one of the things that's interesting to me is we think these are modern problems, but they're
Yep.
not.
Yep.
The whole idea of what is a meritocracy and how do you actually design a fair system for promoting and discovering talent. These are very ancient problems. They were debated in the time of Hammurabi. These are not new problems. One tendency that I sort of really resist is our modern tendency to think that our predecessors were idiots, that they knew
Mhm.
nothing about complex society or human nature, or that we are the first generation to discover justice or injustice or any of it. We're not. This is both a cause for celebration and sometimes a source of despair, because we have known about some of these problems for thousands of years. And we still don't have a solution. On the other hand, we are not inventing something out of whole cloth. Other people have proposed ideas, and sometimes they have worked. So we are not alone, I guess, is my point. We are neither the most enlightened people in the history of the world, nor are we the worst.
Mm.
The problems that we struggle with are old problems that we have been dealing with for a long time, and we constantly try new things, and sometimes they work a little bit, sometimes they work a lot. But we can't give up, and we shouldn't think that somehow we're alone, and that we're doing things so radical that there's nothing to look at in history to see how things might turn out.
Mike Watson is in the house. He asked a great question. I want to ask that a little bit later. Shala asked a great question, and I'll ask that too. But first, you have 4 strands of philosophy in your book, and I just put that on the board in the back there. So in your world, in the world of Dara, there are 4 big strands of philosophy, and people, proponents of these 4 different schools, they have their arguments, and the schools are incentivism, patternism, moralism, and fluxism. And Ken was so funny because as I'm reading this book, you're like, am I an incentivist? And then 5 pages later, I think I'm a moralist. And then, oh no, wait a minute. Well, fluxism has there's a point to fluxism. And then, well, patternism makes total sense. Can you briefly describe, very briefly, so what are the main pillars of your
I I
fictional philosophy?
Yeah, I can indeed. These philosophies obviously draw on human philosophies, but they also,
Hmm.
I think, represent um, tendencies we have in society. The moralists are judgmental. They are,
That's
you
me.
know, they are. I think there's a bit of moralist in all of us. They represent something like the Confucians in East Asia and the fundamentalist Christians in West, in Western thinking. They are the people who believe a lot in tradition, in order, in the idea that there is right and wrong, and that when things go wrong, it's because there's evil in the world, and that it's always about personal responsibility. It's to make society better, you have to push hard for individual responsibility, for people to quote unquote do the right thing. So moralists are people who are very judgmental. If you're poor, it's because you did something wrong, and if you're rich, it's because you worked hard and worship Jesus. This is the way
Yeah,
that
but that,
people like this think.
you're right. And, you're making moralism sound so bad, but there's some good parts. I mean, they have certain traditions that okay, I'm gonna talk myself into a corner. I'll shut up.
Okay. But
No,
moralists
continue.
also are important because they do believe in doing the right thing, and that often means they're willing to sacrifice. They're often in private some of the best people you'll meet, because these are the people who will stand up and do the right thing, even when it doesn't pay. The great Christian martyrs and the great Confucian scholars. These are people who, because they have these strong ideals and strong commitments to ideals, they're willing to sacrifice themselves to defend those ideals. You need people like that. So, I don't want to make them sound like hypocrites. They're not. Oftentimes they're deeply judgmental, but that's also because they're also very committed to quote unquote doing the right thing. They quote from the ancient sages, but they're also willing to put their lives on the line to live up to those ideals. So, they're not bad people. They are people of ordinary moral courage who often have very deep commitment that they're willing to stand behind. Incentivists are much more like the way we talk about human motivation. They are
That's the carrot
creatures.
and the stick model of school of
Yes,
thought,
yes,
kind of.
they are creatures of economics. So the traditional analog would be the Adam Smith school of thinking, or in Chinese legal philosophical tradition, the legalists. These are the people who believe that people do act only out of self-interest. So either they'll do something because it will gain them something, or because they'll do it because they want to avoid the consequences of not doing it. People are just creatures of self-interest. You have to give them incentives to do things, and everything in society should be structured around incentives. These are the people who, when you talk about a moral issue such as abortion, will talk about the economics of abortion. These are the people who, when you debate a moral issue like slavery, will talk about the economics of slavery. Now, the way I describe them, it sounds like I have a lot of contempt for them. And that is true. I do find economics and economists in general, when their policy, modern economics and modern economists, I do find many of their arguments very much objectionable. But at the same time,
I
incentive.
have to jump in here because I'm so glad you said that, because one of my, and this show is not about me, give me 10 seconds. I find it terrible when economists comment on social issues and issues of social science and look at this in a very binary way. For me, who I studied 2 semesters of sociology before I dropped out, it's terrible because there are a lot of people in to comment on these issues who are way more qualified than economists. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you,
Because I
Draxtor.
wasn't sure where you stand with this,
I,
Ken. We can be
I,
friends again. We can be friends again.
yes,
Good.
I share with you these ideas. But at the same time, I don't want to say that somehow their ideas aren't worth listening
Oh
to,
yeah, yeah.
because in a lot of cases, um, people are driven by self-interest. Why we can't deny that. This is reality. It is important to think about what incentives are, and why people do what they do. It is important to think about what's in it for them, and to look behind the professed motivations of people to see, whether they are in fact motivated by private gain as opposed to some public-minded ideal they're spouting. So, I don't think they're entirely worthless. The fluxists and the patternists, on the other hand, represent sort of the reason, intellect, scientific mindset versus the more spiritual, humanist view
Mhm.
of life. the patternists are sort of like the strain of thinking that's been in dominance since the Enlightenment. It's the idea that the universe is knowable. There are patterns, and we can discover these patterns, and we can make sense of the world. The universe ultimately is not a place of magic. It's a place of reason. It's a place where things work like clockwork. You can discover universal laws and invent machines that take advantage of those universal laws, and everything can be explained by causes and effects. The fluxists, on the other hand, are more like the transcendentalists, the Taoists, the more spiritual minded people who say, look, you can reason and debate and apply logic to everything if you want, but ultimately humans are not about those things. We live finite lives within an infinite universe. And sometimes the best thing to do is to just let yourself go and go with the flow of the world.
And there's some fatalism in there too. Stella here in the audience says, "I like the idea of fluxism." I always thought that's also the negative side of it to me in the story. It's like, okay, there's a certain amount of fatalism wrapped into this, I guess.
That's right. If you're a fluxist, I mean, all of these philosophies have their positive aspects and also negative aspects. And I mean, fluxists they're not the people who will start revolutions. They may be the people to walk away from Omelas, but they're not going to stay and fight. They're just not. You can count on the moralists if they have a spiritual awakening to fight against dystopias. But the fluxists are not going to be the people. They will find private ways of retreating away from dystopia. They will find their own refuge, but they're not the ones to start revolutions. So Mimi's teacher, Luanzia, turns out to be a bit of a patternist and a fluxist, and he knows that he's not suited for politics, but rather than trying to work to make politics more healthy, he decides that he would just rather leave and drift around the islands in a balloon because he doesn't want to deal with people. No, I think all of us probably have some sympathy for that too. I mean, I'm sure there are days when we wake up and we decide that the best thing to do would be to just go move into a mountain hut somewhere and move away from people.
This is every time I am in a mountain hut, I want to go back to the city. And if I'm in the city, go like, oh my God, these people drive me nuts. I want to be in a mountain hut. This leads perfectly to the second excerpt. A couple of comments here. And Mike, we'll pick up this question in a little bit. And also, Shyla asked a great question about who, in your opinion, are these different opinions of all these different characters, which character best expresses your views? We'll pick that up afterwards as well. Get ready for the second excerpt, Ken, and I'm going to read this brief excerpt that we have here where Zumi, again, now traveling with her teacher Luanzia, and he introduces her to all these different philosophy strands. And here Zumi says, while they're traveling in the balloon, she says, all thanks to your teaching, combining the preference for fire from incentivism and the understanding of wind from patternism, it required but the confidence and grace of secure fluxism to implement a moralist plan. Luan stared at her, mouth agape. I'm not sure what this interpretation. Zumi broke down into peals of laughter. You have to admit that was a pretty good impression of you. So she's making fun of him, as the student here implementing all these different four strands into a plan, so that I found that hilarious. So
Okay.
what are we hearing now? They're in the balloon.
Yeah. So after Mimi, after the last excerpt, Mimi meets Luanzia, who is this amazing strategist, great scholar, who is very important to the rise of the new empire. But he decided that courtly life and politics wasn't for him. He didn't want to deal with it. So rather than staying within the court where he was unhappy, he decides to travel around Dara in disguise and just drift around in a hot air balloon. And he meets Mimi, and Mimi begs him to take her on as a student because she has no opportunity to study in any other way. This was her only way out. And he agrees to take her on. And the two begin to have this wonderful mentor-mentee relationship, where he plays the role of surrogate parent to her. And the scene that I'm about to read to you is from earlier on when she's first studying with him, and it's very typical of their relationship. While Luan steered the balloon, Zomi practiced her Zendari letters on the slate with a piece of chalk. The breeze was steady and strong, scented with the clean smell of the open sea. "How much longer until we reach Crescent Island?" asked Zomi. She stopped writing and yawned. "If the wind holds steady, probably another 2 days. But the wind never is steady," said Luan. He looked at Zomi affectionately. "Already tired? You've only been writing for a quarter of an hour." "I'm bored and memorized all the letters and their sounds 2 days ago, and you're just making me write the same thing over and over again. When will you teach me the Ano logograms? Will it take more than 5 days?" Luan laughed. "You'll have to learn classical Ano along with the logograms, and it would take you many years to master them." "Years? Then we better start right away." "Oh, don't be so impatient. I can't teach you how to carve wax in the gondola. The knife can be a dangerous tool with this balloon swinging around like this." "Come to think of it, I don't even know if I want to waste my time learning the Ano logograms. Isn't it enough to learn one way of writing?" Luan had never encountered any student who thought it might be all right not to learn the Ano logograms. But then again, Zomi was not like the students who could afford private tutors or academics. "We'll talk about the logograms another time. For now, you still need more practice writing the 100 names with Zendari letters. Your handwriting is terrible." "It's hard to fit the letters inside the small squares you've drawn. And why do I have to put them in the squares anyway?" "The Zendari letters were invented long after the Ano logograms. We arranged them into word squares in imitation of the shapes of the logograms, so that if they're used together, as sometimes happens when you need to gloss an obscure or new logogram, their shapes harmonize. It's not enough that one can write, one must also write with beauty." "Why does beauty matter?" asked Zomi, an edge in her voice. "Isn't it enough that my meaning comes through?" Luan looked at the scar on her face and the walking stick on the floor of the gondola next to her legs and realized that he had struck a sore point. "There are many kinds of beauty in the world, some of which are the province of gods, and some of which are the province of mankind. Beauty of expression when writing is within the control of the writer, and elegant calligraphy prepares the mind to be persuaded." "Sounds like you're saying that the well-dressed will be listened to more," muttered Zomi. Luan sighed. "That's not what I meant, but I can see why you feel that way. Since you've asked me to be your teacher, you must do as I say on this. Practice forming the letters within the squares in pleasing proportions. No matter how much you hate it, it's a vital skill." Reluctantly, Zomi went back to writing, but after a few moments of silence, she piped up again. "This reminds me of carving the lucky cakes for the High Autumn Festival. Mama always said I was too impatient to make the pretty patterns in the pastry before baking, but at least there you get something delicious at the end." Are you suggesting that I get you some sticky rice flour so that you can make edible word squares?" Luan asked sarcastically. Zomi looked up. "Oh, that would be great. Teacher, can we? Can we? If we get some honey, I'll make a cone out of paper and cut off the tip so that I can write the Zendari letters using the dripping honey. And we can get some lotus seeds and coconut shavings. If you put as much energy into practicing your letters as you do into dreaming up new foods, you would have mastered proper handwriting by now." Zomi stared at him for a moment, lowered her eyes, and went back to writing. Her hand moved across the slate, very, very slowly. Luan sighed again. "Not every mind learns the same way. A knife needs to be sharpened against stone, but a pearl needs to be polished with soft cloth. I found infinite joy and comfort in the solitude of repetitious drilling and practice, but perhaps a different method is needed for this one. Do you want to learn to fly the balloon instead?" Zomi dropped the slate and climbed up to stand next to him in an instant. "First, you have to find out where the winds are," said Luan. "Remember, a balloon has no way of propelling itself. It must ride the winds." Why do you ride around in a balloon instead of an airship? Luan laughed. Airships require the special lift gas from Mount Kiji. They're reserved for the Imperial Air Force and government business. Maybe there are other gases that will do just as well. Maybe, but I don't know of any such gases. Besides, I like balloons. Airships are about getting from one place to another, and one worries constantly about propulsion. Flying a balloon, on the other hand, is more relaxing. Zomi picked up Luan's drinking gourd, uncapped it, and turned it upside down over the side of the gondola. Luan leaped to grab the calabash. Easy, easy. You just need a little bit to test the wind. Don't waste all the wine. This is all I have until we get to Inksa on Crescent Island. You drank too much anyway. But this time Zomi took care to tip the gourd over gently and watched as the thin stream went straight down into the sea. There's no wind below us. No wind in a direction different from the one we're heading in, corrected Luan. How do you find out where the winds are above us? Said Zomi. She squinted at the sky above them. A few wispy clouds dotted the empty blueness. We can't pour wine upward. Oh, how I wish I were a Krubin, and then I could spray water up through my blowhole and see the winds. Luan rummaged in the footlocker at the bottom of the gondola and retrieved something that looked like a stack of paper. He pulled on the ring at the top, and the stack of paper sprang up into a cube-shaped lantern with pleated paper sides and an internal bamboo skeleton that had been folded into a compressed shape. The bottom was open with a wire crosspiece and held a candle inside the paper lantern. That's really neat, said Zomi. It's my invention, said Luan, pride in his voice. These floating lanterns were known since time immemorial, but I came up with the collapsible bamboo skeleton that would allow them to be easily transported. Luan attached a thin silk string to the bottom of the lantern, handed the string to Zomi, and lit the candle. As the air inside the lantern grew heated, the balloon began to float. Lean out the side of the gondola, Luan instructed. Let the string out. This is a kite balloon, and you can use it to sense the direction of the winds above us. Okay, so I'll stop there. But basically, they use these techniques to find out where the winds are above, below, and around them. And that is how they can use the winds to decide in which direction to drift. And Zomi found this sort of practical learning much more interesting to her than just drilling and practicing her letters.
Thank you, Ken. It's a wonderful reading. If you're just tuning in, we just have 25 minutes left. Such a wonderful time and such great reading. And what I love about this excerpt too, you can see the how she challenges with the her teacher Luan, where she says, "Well, are you saying that people who are well dressed are taken more seriously?" And the answer, of course, is, well, in the current society, unfortunately, yes. Um, some idiots with a good suit and a nice tie, they're seen as more trustworthy and more intelligent than others who may have, I don't know, some unwashed greasy hair, I guess. Ken is
I love it.
floating in the chair. Uh, Stand up one more time, Ken, and then we'll have you seated.
Okay. Oh, dude.
Hover over. See, writing epic fantasy, thousands and thousands of pages, Ken, is not a problem for you, but a challenge is to sit down, which is normal for all of us. Sitting
It's
down.
so true. Look at this. I just don't get it. I don't understand why I'm sinking into the seat. Okay. You want me to just do a sit here? Let's see. That's interesting. Can you float me back into the right place?
Just have to hover over the chair,
Hold
and
on.
then just click, not there, not right click, just normal click on the chair,
Okay,
and
let
then
me
you'll be there.
try. Yeah,
Um,
this is so funny. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Okay, I'm clicking on the chair. Nope, that won't do it.
I'm gonna pick up a few questions. There you
There
go.
we go. Thank God. Okay.
There's so many good questions, but one of the questions that I want to pick up real quick, and Mike Watson, I will pose your question, but very briefly, I want to address the fact that there is a lot of warfare, uh, a lot of violence, and and usually on the backs of poor people, peasants and soldiers, and lots of times these people at the helm of the armies and the ruling elite, they give soldiers freedom to rape and pillage as sort of rewards. And as far as I'm concerned, everyone, even the most sympathetic characters that you root for, are you could argue they're all kind of war criminals, basically, right? I mean, everybody who is engaged in this constant battling is doing stuff that is absolutely atrocious and certainly not okay in my moral, not moralist, but in my moral book. But my question to you is, i- i- do you think, have you come out of this writing process and believing that this is human nature? And because one of the characters actually, I joked on Twitter and said, the character of Gia, she fought the military-industrial complex, and the military-industrial complex won. Because we're now, again, I mean, we're always in the times of war, but right now the invasion of Ukraine through Vladimir Putin, is in the news. I guess the question is, where do you stand on the nature of us humans? I mean, is there, can you see a future where we essentially embrace love and peace and happiness, and can do away with being prepared for war?
This is one of those ironic things, right? If you go back and read epic fantasy of all sorts, as you say, almost all the great leaders are actually just war criminals. And that's not just true of epic fantasy, it's true of history. I mean, I constantly see Genghis Khan being quoted.
Hmm.
And I'm just sort of like, why are we quoting, the only one of the greatest war criminals of all time, and we're quoting him as though he's some sort of hero. It's no different from, again, you study any kind of history, and there are always these awesome leaders that you're supposed to love, and they're all terrible people. They're all
It's very
people
much
who
also how history is constructed, and whoever is sort of constructing these myths, right? I mean, who is sort of the biographer of these people too, or then maybe
right.
with yeah.
And the irony, of course, is oftentimes the biography, even written by the conqueror people, end up valorizing the conquerors, which is one of those things about human nature that is very hard to explain. But we have a tendency to worship those who are powerful. So even when we are descendants of those who were um, harmed terribly by these evil people in the past, sometimes the way we talk about them, it almost sounds like we admire them or something, which is
Hmm.
insane. But that's
Hmm.
that's often how we are. Um, but anyway, back to your original point about where do I stand on this. I find it very hard to be optimistic the way I used to be. I was very optimistic. I was hoping that we would progress and move forward. And we just don't. A lot of times we do the same terrible things. It's just that we've learned to explain them better.
Mm.
We've learned to defend our hypocrisy better. Our wars are not necessarily more just. They just sound more just. It's sort of like reading Steven Pinker's book, which claims that violence has been reduced in human history and that we are getting better. But this is all nonsense. You dig into it, his manipulations of statistics and the way he talks
Mm.
about this, it's pure nonsense. And yet he is quoted as some sort of authority. It's one of the great ironies of modernity that because there's so many people spouting so many opinions, whatever opinion that you want to have, you can find some authority to support it. This is why conspiracy theories are all over the place, and wrong ideas and disinformation is everywhere. Um, you know, uh, People aren't even calling him out as a spouter of disinformation, but he is. So
Mm.
anyway, my point is, I find it very hard to be optimistic about human nature
Mm.
sometimes,
Mm.
but I can't go against my own nature, which is to be optimistic.
Mhm.
I one analogy I would use is my favorite Star Trek is The Next Generation, because
Same. Yep.
uh, that is one, this whole idea of an optimistic view of human nature, that we can actually leave war and greed and all of these things behind, and that we can actually become closer to our nature as angels. The whole idea of hopefulness, of humans actually becoming better, of a federation that actually lives up to its own ideals. This is like something that I could actually believe in. But what you can see after that is people found those stories boring. People found the next generation hopefulness difficult. People found it implausible that humans and the crew of the starship would not have their own internal conflicts. So you ended up with a much darker DS9, and then after that, every Star Trek show has gotten darker and darker and darker. They're all infected deeply by the spirit of 9/11, by the spirit of the just war, by the idea that there is good and evil, and that because we're on the side of good, anything we do is justified. It's a descent into this sort of darker view of human nature that has been hard to recover from. But I'm not going to give up. I still believe that human nature can ultimately go back to the next generation way of looking at things, because I think there are other challenges that I find to be far more interesting than trying to figure out who is number one on this globe, and whether we get to maintain our hegemony. These are not things that I'm interested in.
I thought USA is number one. Claude Albanese here in the local chat says, "I'm afraid that peace and tranquility are not dramatically interesting." This is interesting because we do talk a lot with the guests about this. There's some some opinions out there go like, you know what, all this kind of stuff does not make for good drama, and that's why it's not out there. I tend to disagree with that. I think you can I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson is always a great example of a practitioner who is able to write stuff that is interesting and but is also utopian. But Claude, we hear this all the time. I mean, there is a certain point to this. Really quick, let me scroll back here through the chat, because somebody asked about Silk Punk, and we actually had this prepared. Oh yeah, Stella says, when you first spoke on Second Life Book Club, I asked you about the concept of Silk Punk, which you defined. So this is a term that you invented and defined, and now other people are claiming this, as I learned through my research team. They informed me that that people are sort of claiming they are in that realm, or maybe even saying that they invented it, whatever. But how do you feel your current works are expanding the concept? And my added question would be, how do you feel about Silk Punk, this term that you invented, making the rounds, and maybe is also misattributed? Are you kind of pissed off at that? I actually don't follow that
Yeah,
drama.
I don't actually know if there's drama. I guess I'm outside of it, which is pretty awesome.
No, that's awesome. That is that's where you want to be.
I'm always happy when I'm not in drama. My attitude has always been, this is the word I invented to describe my thing. If you guys want to use it to describe your thing, you're welcome to do it. But it doesn't really change how I use it. It's a word in my own idiolect, and I'm not going. I don't really care what other people do with it. So Stella, to your point, I invented the term to describe what I wanted to do with the Dandelion Dynasty, and I think I finally, with the last book, gotten it out, right? So the key about Soappunk, I guess this is the big thing that's sort of interesting to me. A lot of people use Soappunk because they're obsessed with the Chineseness of it, which is the part that I care about the least. As I've explained many times, the whole reason of calling it Soappunk is because it is about a particular technology aesthetic, which is inspired by East Asian antiquity, and it's about using East Asian mythological and political tropes to re-examine modernity, to re-examine the history of my own country, the United States, and to retell the modern American story in a way that I found interesting. It's sort of like, people who write in steampunk. There are two types of writers who are interested in steampunk. There are writers who write steampunk because they're actually interested in Victorian England. And there are people who write steampunk because they're interested in using that trope, that set of tropes, to talk about modernity. It's the same thing here. I'm interested in Soappunk not because of the Chineseness of it, but because of the Americanness of it. Soappunk to me is interesting because I can use it to talk about modernity in a way that I see no one else do, and then I don't see anyone else do it this way. And I can say something new, something interesting, and I can get into this whole discussion about what a constitution is in a way that, again, I've seen no one else do it this way. I want to talk about why it is that some constitutions work better than others, why it is that I think the American constitutional crisis has nothing to do with technocratic solutions about the number of senators per state or whether the Supreme Court should be packed or not. These are technocratic debates over nonsense as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental issue about constitutionalism is, do we have the same American story? And if we don't, whose American story gets to be the story, and who gets to tell that story? That's what we're arguing over. It's a constitutional crisis over the story, not about little technocratic nonsense about the lover should be here or there. So anyway, my point is that people who want to use Soappunk to describe the Chineseness of whatever they're doing, they're welcome to do so. If they want to do it to describe something else, they're welcome to do that too. I don't particularly care about that. What I care about is the punkish aspect. To me is far more interesting. This punkish refusal to tell the story the way everyone else does. I'm interested in reimagine modernity through this lens and trying to see if I can learn something new about how we got to where we are and where we can go next.
Here's a question or comment earlier, and this is really great. This ties in with what you just said and also what we talked about earlier. And it's also good because this program gets accused to being so America-centric. And here's a question from a British person living in Finland. So that's good.
I love it.
Internationalism. Mike Watson asks, constitutions and legal statutes are creative pieces of writing that assume quasi-sacred statuses at texts beyond reproach. I mean, this is what you were talking about earlier.
Yep.
And Mike adds, in writing about this kind of legal writing, is a literary writer such as yourself able to undermine the unquestionable status of legal texts such as constitutions? I guess that's kind of what you're doing, right? And make it.
I think in my good days, I'm hoping that's the case. Man, you're a reader after my own heart. I wish that were the case.
Mike, you gotta get these books. You love them.
I know, Mike. Thank you, but I think most of the time people are just like, whatever. I want to be entertained, which is totally fine because I'm trying to, do my own thing. I think my goal with these books is to tell my own story, and readers are free to interpret these stories the way they like. And to your point, Draxtor, if the story is actually worth reading, I think ultimately it has to be open to just multiple interpretations. I mean, people want to interpret to be about whatever it is that moves them, and then the story is about that for them.
That's what makes them last. I mean, to me as a reader, that's what makes them last, and it makes them significant. Again, like I said earlier, now to me, I got to reread this because right now, everything is about the Russian Revolution and Stalin and everything, and so I gotta cleanse that, Ken. And then when I reread it, I don't know what it's gonna be
I
about.
actually like your interpretation. If you want to interpret that way, you're totally fine to interpret that way. I mean, Draxtor, look, I really do agree with this. I mean, I think, look, a lot of us now, when we go back to read Shakespeare's plays, I'm sure we're interpreting them in ways that the bard never intended. But it doesn't really matter. The reason why a classic is a great classic is because they are self-adapting, self-translating, self-transforming. They are so open that down throughout the ages, as readers change, they change interpretation as well. They are, quote unquote, living constitutions. They are texts that are subject to interpretation, to be interpreted anew with every generation. And who doesn't want to write a classic? Who sets out to
Absolutely.
write something only for one moment and for one group of people? I certainly don't. So I wrote my book, and like all books, they're rooted in a particular moment. My book is rooted in this very unique moment in the 20th century, in the 21st century. Good Lord, I'm so old that I keep on having issue with this.
We are
In the 20
surrounded by people who don't even know what the 20th century
I
is.
know, I know.
Jesus.
So, my books are written in this unique moment in the 21st century where, I am obsessed with constitutionalism, with the American story, with the idea of, does America maintaining its hegemony, is that actually a good thing? Does that actually make sense? Is that something worth killing a lot of people for? These are questions that motivated this book, what got me to write this book in the first place. But if the book is worth reading, they're going to be open to interpretation by readers who are not concerned about these things, who are concerned about entirely different things. And hopefully, in a few decades, it will stay relevant because readers will have other things to read into them. That's my hope.
Stella says, wonders if we need to reread War and Peace. Absolutely, you need, Stella, because this is also on my agenda for when we take off with the book club for 2 months in the summer. War and Peace is on the agenda, and also Remembrance of Times Past. Marcel Proust is also on the agenda. It's
Which
going to
are
be,
both amazing books. So awesome.
yep. And so, Ken, I'm sorry, I can't reread. I was lying. I'm not going to reread your books. Why? No, but they're awesome. We have 5 minutes left. Ken Liu is here, and the Dandelion Dynasty is now a series of 4 books, and I think the last one is the last. Let me verify. The Speaking Bones is coming out in June. Absolutely amazing, mind-boggling. The scope. I can't believe it. I would like to bow in front of you, Ken, like a lot of your protagonists, with my head on the floor, banging it on the floor, like a lot of people. A quick last question, and people, please put stuff in. We got to be quick, but if you have questions, put them in now. I have a question. A good friend of mine here in Second Life, very, very bright guy, French guy, great artist. We talked about the move to authoritarianism and right wing all across the world in their various national shades of color. And he said to me, and we agreed on the analysis. And he said, you know what? I think the only way to really help us is a benevolent king. And I was a little shocked about that, to be honest with you, Ken. But I see this. I understand the sentiment. People do, there's chaos, there's so many threats, and people crave this, what they feel is I don't know, the benevolent, I guess, the father. And now that I read these 2 books, it's like this is also what is so woven into the fabric of these books, the kind of the longing for this, what we guess perceive as simplicity, while frankly democracy should be our goal. But anyways, can you understand that that sentiment?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, democracy is very hard work. It's very, very hard work. And I feel like,
Oops.
the
Uh-oh. We're losing Ken. We're losing audio. Oh no. Ken is being absorbed by a benevolent king somewhere. A king has executed him because he is too controversial.
this
Okay.
actually effective.
Ken, you were breaking up, and
Oh, sorry. Am I back?
you're back. You have 1 minute. Go.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you for having me here. As Draxtor said, the 4th book, Speaking Bones, is coming out next month, and that is the final book in the series. I don't plan on writing any more in the series.
Oh, that was I was going to ask that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, this is wrapped up. It's gone. It's gonna be finished. And the whole series is done. I wrapped up the whole story. I don't think I have any answers for these eternal questions, but I'm hoping that people will feel, they will cheer for the heroes, and they will they will also cheer when the villains get their comeuppance. And I tell a story that is very old-fashioned in a lot of ways. It is the sort of story that you might find in the Iliad or the Odyssey, where there's an emotional magic in the world, and things turn out the way they should turn out. And for me, that's always the magic of literature. In the real world, we don't have plots, and things don't work out the way we want them to. But in literature, the best fantasies always end up exactly with the way they should be, even though it remains totally surprising.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I didn't mean to rush you. You can stick around if you can. I want to be mindful of people's time. This is just so wonderful. And again, please, folks, seek out start with the Grace of Kings that lays out the world, and then boom, Wall of Storms. I can only imagine what happens next. Tsai in the local chat says there's a video on YouTube, How to Rule, that'll show you in 10 minutes that why a benevolent king is a bad plan. All right, so that's good.
Thank you everyone for asking the questions and sticking around. I really loved it. This is always so fun to come here and talk to people who care about books and stories and just
Well, the only
it's a good time.
The only downside, Ken, what I really hate about this book club, we're inviting these smart, learned, bookish folks, and then they always cop out like, yeah, I don't have an answer to these problems that I lay out in my 3,000 page book, and I'm like, what the heck? I could have read How to Rule. Again, I could have watched this video, How to Rule the World, in 10 minutes.
Oh my god. Oh, Draxtor, that should be YouTube's advertisement. They should advertise and say, look, you can choose to read 3,000 pages and there's no answers, or you can choose to watch a video in 10 minutes.
Oh my God, please, nobody please call the marketing department, because they will do it. We have been bumping here in the book club, and Jessica knows this. We have seen a YouTube ad of a woman from Australia that has an advertisement about her ebook business, and she proudly proclaims in this 30-second ad, "Hi, I'm making $10,000 with my ebook business, but I don't really care about reading, and I have no aspirations to writing anything. If you want to learn how to do this, click this ad." And I'm like, you know what? I mean, we're so far down. I mean, okay, I'm going to wrap the show. People go like, Draxtor, please don't tell us about the anti-intellectualism. We know what you're talking about. I will just say thank you, Ken. Thank you, audience. Ken sent me this link about the Strand Beast. I just put up this slide to leave you with, which is absolutely amazing artist that makes these huge contraptions that walk around on the beach. I was trying to source that here in Second Life for the show. There's a connection to Ken's world with these, but just want to end with this slide here. Thank you for watching on YouTube. Thank you for coming in world. The Second Life Book Club, let's run through the credit list real quick. Second Life Book Club is every Wednesday, 12 o'clock Pacific time. Sometimes we're accommodating other time zones. slbookclub@draxtor.com is the email address. The show is produced by Isabel Sharon, Shiloh the Super Gecko, and myself. Location manager, master builder Ruby. Avatars are made by Ruby and Bespoke Caravan. Research by Shiloh the Super Gecko and Monkey. We have a lot of sponsors. I'm just going to put this slide up here real quick. Big thanks to Linden Lab. They gave us these 3 islands. We need a 4th one because we're completely full now with, I think, about 80 book worlds that you can wander around, teleport around, and learn more about the authors. They're all persistent. We're not going to take this stuff down. Find the calendar Discord Flickr on the sandwich boards around the island, again, to recommend authors and so on. slbookclub@draxtor.com, or message Jared the bot. That's the Second Life name, Jared bot. And don't forget to tip our volunteer staff. Please use the Linden shekels, dollars in your pocket. They're jingling around, and put them in the tip jar. Now we have a new thing. Shala and Monkey prepared links, and they were posting links to stuff Ken was talking about, and we compiled them here in this statue that I'm putting up on the table in front of us, right in front of the orchid. If you click on it, it will give you a note card, and it has all the links of the references that Ken made or the topics that came up. And oh, Shyla says it's not yet in there. Okay, she's putting it together, so this might take a few minutes. Anyway, next week we're together again, and next week's author is Lucy McKnight Hardy with a book called Dead Relatives. All right? So we just talked about utopianism and good stuff. This is terrible, dark stuff. And we'll see you next week, June 1st, 12 o'clock, Second Lifetime. Thank you. Bye.